In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
And the thing we have to realize, the key factor here is we have to always say, is this boss a good boss for me? Because, a boss who is grumpy might be fine for somebody else. A boss who's nice might be great for someone else. We always have to take responsibility of how that relationship works for where we are in our career and what we need to do. And the key thing that people need to remember is that we cannot control or change other people. All we can do is control or change how we react, how we interact, how we relate to others. So if you have a boss that is not easy for you, you could ask that boss to do something different, but there's no guarantee that boss is going to be nicer or be more brave, right? So you have to figure out what you can do more of, less of, or differently to build that relationship. And truthfully, Aga, we all kind of like the way we operate, right? We all like I'm a fast talker, as you have noticed. And I'm sure some of your listeners are wishing I would slow down, and I'm just wishing they could listen faster because that would be easier for me. So we have to get out of this idea that they need to change, and we got to figure out what we need to do.
I'm Abbajay, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.abbajay.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 58 of the Culture Lab. So apart from our regular episodes, we have also been posting bonus episodes that we call the Culture Lab audio postcards, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening to them. Today, my guest is Mary Abbajay, the author of the best-selling Managing Up: How to Move Up, Win at Work, and Succeed with Any Type of Boss. Mary is also the president of Career Stone Group, and we recorded this episode way before the outbreak of the pandemic. But in spite of that, I find this conversation extremely relevant, perhaps even more than ever. Mary talks about how to manage and cultivate a healthy relationship with someone who's really critical to our careers and our ability to make a dent in the world. She addresses many vital issues that pertain to this relationship, the relationship with our bosses. And she talks about one of the biggest problems that many people experience currently while working remotely: bosses who have gone into an overdrive when it comes to controlling and micromanaging. I'm sure that you will enjoy this episode because apart from a ton of useful advice, Mary is also a wonderfully engaging speaker, and to her tremendous credit, she was completely unfazed by the maddening background noise that we had because someone in the building decided to start drilling while we were recording. Thankfully, most of the noise has been cleared by our amazing sound engineer, James, so I'm sure that you will have a great experience listening to our conversation. Enjoy. Mary, welcome to Culture Lab.
Thank you so much, Aga. I'm quite honored and excited to be talking with you today.
I'm extremely excited to be talking to you today because you talk about a really, really interesting topic. But before we start discussing managing up, what it means, and so on and so forth, I just want to ask you to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is Mary Abbajay. I live in Washington, D.C., but none of that stuff is my fault. I am a consultant for organizational and leadership development. So we work with organizations and individuals to create successful workplaces or to be successful in your workplace. I am the author of Managing Up, How to Move Up, Win at Work, and Succeed with Any Kind of Boss. And that book is really about helping people take control of their careers so they can be successful, the organization can be successful, and the other people around us can be successful.
I love that. And first of all, I want to say congrats on the book. It's amazing.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that a lot of people get a lot of benefit from it, but we'll talk about it. So listeners, be patient. But before we go there, I want to ask you about the early cultural influences, because as you know, this is a podcast about culture. And so I'm always curious what shaped our guests in terms of those early childhood influences. How did you grow up and what impact did it have on the person that you are today?
Well, oh my gosh, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking that. Well, I am the child of, my father is a first generation American. My grandparents came from Lebanon, and my mother was pretty much from a very poor background, pretty just American, that sort of thing. But, my father was an entrepreneur, and, his family, they grew up very, very poor, and they were Arabs back in the 20s and the 30s when that wasn't really cool. And, everyone in my father's family, including my father, really understood the value of taking control of your own life, that sort of like recent immigrant work ethic where you have to do what you have to do and you have to figure it out. And you can't rely on other people to hold your hand and do stuff. And so, watching my dad navigate his life and watching him become very successful on his own without a college education was really inspiring to me. And it's all about understanding that other people matter, right? We have to work with other people, but we also have to take control of our own lives. And my mom was the same way. Like my family was very independent. Us kids were allowed to make whatever choices that we wanted to make in terms of how we wanted to spend our time. But if we made a choice to do something, we had to stick with it. Like we had to really commit to it. And so that sort of feeling of taking control, be choiceful, make your choices, have agency, but be responsible, take responsibility for what your choices are, I think really had a deep impact on me.
I love that. And so what were the early choices that gradually brought you to where you are today? I'm curious, as a kid, what did you commit to and what did you start pursuing?
I committed early on to working. Like I was the workhorse in the family. I was a middle child, but I always thought if I put in the extra effort, I'm going to get more in return. So my father would say oh, we all had chores, right? But if there was an extra chore, there'd be extra money attached to it. And I quickly saw the value of putting in extra labor, extra work for getting more in return. So that was one choice, the choice to work. And I am a workaholic. I am very passionate about working. I always will be. I think I have been since I was a child. And the other choice was when we would take things on, like if we chose to play in a sports team, we were very encouraged to do that stuff. We had to really try to be the best at it that we were. So it was really about making the choice to do extra stuff, go the extra effort. And I can remember when I turned 16, that's how old you are when you can drive in the States, or at least in Ohio. And while all my friends were going out to get their driver's license, I went out to get a job because I could not wait to start making my own money and be independent.
Wow, this is incredible. So I guess, having started working so early on, I'm sure that you've had a lot of experiences with bosses. And
Yes,
this is what we're going to talk about today. And it's funny, because when I was preparing for this interview, I came across one of Scott Adams' brilliant Dilbert comic strips. And I will describe it for you and for the listeners. So the first frame shows the pointy-haired boss telling Alice, I want you to interview a job candidate. Let me know what you think of him. And then we have the second frame that shows Alice interviewing the candidate. And she asks the candidate, why did you leave your last job? And the candidate answers, I punched my boss. and the third frame shows Alice with the pointy-haired boss telling him about the candidate. And she says, he's exactly what we need.
That's perfect.
Yeah. And I think, a part of what makes it so funny is that we can all relate to it. And I want to ask you, why do we still have so many bad bosses? I've read a study by the American Psychological Association that says 75% of Americans say that their boss is the most stressful part of their day. Why is this still happening?
It's crazy that it still happens because in America, we spend 85 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars a year on leadership development. But we still have, as you say, 75% of people say their boss is the worst part of their day. So there's a couple reasons why this still happens. Number one, in America, and apparently in Canada too, because they're having the same problem. In America, we tend to promote people based on their technical skills, right? Their ability to do their job. So let's say, Aga, you're a great salesperson. Well, then naturally, I'm going to promote you to be vice president of sales. You're really great at marketing. So you're now chief marketing officer, right? So we promote these people based on their being stellar individual contributors, and we don't even know whether or not they have the aptitude or the acumen to actually manage people. That's dynamic number one. Dynamic number two is that many organizations, I would say most organizations, the only way to further your career, the only way up the food chain, the only way to more money, more prestige is through leadership and management. So you have a lot of people that are becoming managers and supervisors, not because they want to, not because they're going to be good at it, but because it's the only way up. And then the third dynamic that's really at play here is that we don't tend to train people until they've been managers. So Harvard just did a research piece on this, and they found that most people get their first taste of being a boss in their late 20s, early 30s, their first chance at being a supervisor. But most people don't get significant training or development on it until their early 40s. So you have a 10-year gap where people are doing what they're doing. And when people, once you've been doing something for 10 years, your odds of you doing something different is just are very, very slim. So these are the dynamics that mean that we're going to get bosses of all shapes and flavors, right? And some of them are going to be good at it. That's lucky, but many of them are not going to be very good at it. And I think we need to really look at how we are bringing people into management, into bossdom, and really making sure that we're doing it the right way. And the final kind of thing on this is organizations don't necessarily hold managers accountable for managing the people part of their job. They hold them accountable for business results, but not for employee engagement or productivity or positivity. And it's a problem.
It's fascinating because I think it's a global phenomena, because knowing some of my clients, it's quite similar in Europe, in Asia, in Middle East. So these problems, these dynamics, these trends that you've just mentioned, they happen everywhere. It's global. And I remember myself, I have to be honest, when I first got a managerial job, I was 26, I think. I had no idea what I was doing. No idea what I was doing. And you are so right. I think the first time I got some sort of leadership training was really after 10 years.
Yeah.
So I don't even want to think about the terrible things that I did without being aware of what I was doing.
Yeah. And look at how many people work for smaller organizations. At least in America, the majority of people work for what they call small business, which is 500 employees or less. And these organizations don't have robust leadership development programs. They don't have the money for that. And so we just aren't really training people or choosing the right people. So I'm actually glad to hear it's a global problem. That makes me feel less bad as an American.
So your book, Managing Up, addresses an aspect of that organizational life and an aspect of being a boss that hasn't been covered a lot, because you talk about the relationship with our bosses and managing up. So the first thing that I want to ask is, why do you think there's such an imbalance in how much attention we give managing downward? Because of course, when you think about all the books and podcasts and shows and training on how to be a good leader, it's massive. You are totally right that people get that too late in their careers, but it's massive. But there is very little about how to manage the relationship with our bosses.
Yeah, I wonder, because it's so crazy, because most of us, everybody actually, if you have a job, you have a boss. So why aren't we teaching people how to manage up? Because 75% of your time any day no matter what you're doing or what your level is, you are actually following someone else's vision. You're executing some vision that was laid down to you in an organization. And I really think, Aga, I really think the problem is that people don't want to be considered followers. And I call this the F word. When I say to groups and I speak to hundreds of thousands of people, I say, we have to talk about the F word. Can anybody guess what it is? And no one ever guesses it because, at least in America, we don't want to think of ourselves as followers, right? Because we all want to be leaders. Like, how many people have taken a class on how to be a good follower? Nobody, right? Or maybe 3 people. And so we have to stop confusing or conflating the idea with being a follower with being powerless or being a pansy or being a patsy, right? We need to reframe how we look at the leader-follower dynamic and stop looking at it only as a power dynamic and start looking at it as a relationship dynamic. Because in a relationship, everybody has agency, everybody has choice, and everybody has power. And all of us in our organizational lives have to be able to play both leader and follower. And that's why I think we haven't taught people how to manage up, because we're afraid of the word follower.
So, how could we reframe being a follower, and what would a good follower do, and what do they look like?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about managing up and being a follower, you're talking about managing that relationship. So I think that's the other thing people are confused about when they talk about managing up. It's not managing the person, it's managing the relationship. The workplace is a social system, right? So in a social system, we have to work with other people. We have to work with them, around them, sometimes through them, right? And so all of our relationships matter. The ones with our peers, our lateral relationships matter. The ones with the people that work for us, our staff relationships matter, as do the ones above us. And so I want people to stop thinking about being followers, being a power dynamic, but a relationship dynamic. So good followers, good peers, good leaders manage their relationship. So if I am working for you, I'm going to really try to figure out how you like to operate, what works for you, what works for me, and I'm going to try to adapt a little bit so that I can be successful, you can be successful, and the organization can be successful. So good followers are willing to adapt. They're also willing to speak truth to power. Don't get me wrong, but we're willing to take that relationship and do what we can do from where we sit to make that relationship work for you, for me, and for the organization.
And what strikes me is that if you know how to manage that relationship, it's also easier actually to speak truth to power. Because if the relationship is toxic, then clearly speaking truth to power is not really an option. But when you manage that relationship well, then you create that space to be honest and truthful and address really important issues with your boss.
You are
So I
absolutely
can
right.
see definitely huge benefits in terms of that. But before we go to benefits, I'm really curious to talk to you about what is the cost of not managing this relationship, because I guess the cost is huge. And apart from the obvious things, like it can be a career limiting move if you don't have a great relationship with your boss, but I'm sure that there are some other costs that our listeners maybe haven't really thought about. So in other words, what can happen, what is at stake when you don't manage the relationship with your boss really well?
Well, when you don't manage the relationship with your boss, you're not going to get the opportunities for your career, right? So you're not going to get opportunities. We all know that when you have a good, solid, trust-based relationship with your boss, when your boss thinks of you as someone who is on their side and supporting them and helping them, then they're going to give you opportunities. So when you don't have that, when you don't have the relationship, opportunities are going to pass you by. When you actively antagonize or de-energize your boss, they're going to avoid you, and you're not going to get the mentorship or the development. The other thing is when you don't manage that relationship well, is that there's going to be a psychological cost to you. What happens is, when we have a relationship with a boss that we don't like our boss or this or that, then we tend to go into what I call victimhood, and we tend to start complaining, and we get bitter, and we get angry, and we keep pointing our fingers at the boss instead of looking to see what we can do too. So you're also the cost is also to your own psychological health. And thirdly, when we don't try to adapt to other people, we're losing the ability to have a growth mindset. Someone I interviewed for the book said to me, you'll learn more from a bad boss than you ever will from a good boss, because a bad boss will teach you what not to do as a boss. And they'll also show you, if you pay attention, who you are and what you really care about. So our inability to actually manage that relationship as something outside of us is if when we don't do it, we lose the opportunity to learn how to manage difficult things.
Yeah, totally. I can see that. And I also remember from the book, The Originals, a surprising thing was that bosses who seem to be a little bit aloof and sometimes very strict, they also surprisingly sometimes are really strong supporters of ideas that come from the team, stronger supporters than the so-called nice bosses.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
basically, nice bosses just want to be nice, but when the time comes to really support an idea and put their head above the parapet, they will probably not do it as easily as someone who sometimes might feel a little bit grumpy or difficult or challenging. So it's fascinating to me. But Mary, I'm sure, and I've been in this situation as well. That sure there's definitely significant cost of not managing this relationship very well. But some people will say, do you know what? I realize that, and I know that it will cost me a lot, but my boss is really crazy and
Yeah.
I just can't deal with him or her. Do you think that sometimes it really happens? And if it happens, what can people do?
Yeah. So I like to think of bosses as on a spectrum, right? And people, right, and people are very complex individuals. Like as you said, the boss that might be grumpy may be the best champion for you. The boss that's really nice might be easy to work with, but you never get to do anything cool. I like to put people on a spectrum. So on the one hand, you're going to have bosses that are really great. I call them the unicorn bosses that you're really aligned with, that you think alike, you're in sync with. They get you, you get them. When you have that kind of boss, there's not a lot you need to do. You just get to be you, and that is fantastic. But on the other end of the spectrum, the far end of the other spectrum, you're going to have what I call the truly terrible boss, the toxic boss, the screamers, the shouters, the narcissists, the bullies, the people who are abusive, the people that are demeaning and demoralizing. I think these are actually toxic people. And when you have that, when it's on that end of the spectrum, there's not a lot you can do. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but that toxic boss, when you have that, you need to move. You need to manage yourself out of that situation, because no one should work for someone who's truly toxic. But in the middle, you're going to have bosses who are more or less aligned with you, more bosses that are more or less good, bosses that are more or less easy for you to work with. And that is where the art of managing up lives. And the thing we have to realize, the key factor here, is we have to always say, is this boss a good boss for me? Because, a boss who is grumpy might be fine for somebody else. A boss who's nice might be great for someone else. We always have to take responsibility of how that relationship works for where we are in our career and what we need to do. And the key thing that people need to remember is that we cannot control or change other people. All we can do is control or change how we react, how we interact, how we relate to others. So if you have a boss that is not easy for you, you could ask that boss to do something different, but there's no guarantee that boss is going to be nicer or be more brave, right? So you have to figure out what you can do more of, less of, or differently to build that relationship. And truthfully, Aga, we all kind of like the way we operate, right? We all like I'm a fast talker, as you have noticed. And I'm sure some of your listeners are wishing I would slow down, and I'm just wishing they could listen faster, because that would be easier for me. So we have to get out of this idea that they need to change, and we got to figure out what we need to do. So when is time to quit is really up to you. But what I always say to people is you have 3 choices in a difficult situation. And I got this from the Buddhists. Number 1, you can accept the situation. So accept that's who your boss is, and don't be bitter or angry about it. Number 2, you could try to change the situation. Since you can't change them, you can change how you view it, how you interact with it, what you do. Or the third choice when you're with something difficult is to leave the situation. And far too many people don't take that third choice. I think quitting can be an act of courage, and sometimes it's the best choice to make.
Yeah, totally. And I think it takes a little bit of skill to know what are the situations where we can actually change something, and when we should be accepting something, and when it's the time to leave the situation. And I've heard or read, I think it was in an article of yours, actually, in HBR, in Harvard Business Review, where you said that people who work with toxic bosses spend surprisingly long time with them. I think it was 30% actually longer than with other bosses, which sounds to me almost like a Stockholm syndrome is happening there. But I don't know if this is the reason. What is the reason that people don't take that decision to leave earlier rather than later?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. When I did the article for HBR, it was stunning what I discovered. 'Cause of course, HBR wants like real research. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So people say they're up to 2 years longer. And if you work for a toxic boss, I think it's really important for your listeners to hear this. Number one is you have to remember that nobody is coming to save you. HR isn't going to save you. Your boss's boss isn't going to save you, because all too often these toxic bosses are very protected by the upper echelon, or they are the upper echelon, or they're brilliant performers, like they bring in the money, and they really do not get removed from organizations. So you have to really take care of yourself. A couple of things you need to know: if you're working for one, you're going to have a 60% increase in of a risk of heart disease, stroke, and now they're even saying diabetes. People, once you leave a toxic situation, it can take up to 2 years to fully recover. They are actually likening it to Stockholm syndrome, PTSD, and actually, the mental health professionals are now saying it's also even like battered spouse syndrome. So what happens to people when they're working for a toxic situation is their emotional and their physiological and their psychological resources get depleted, right? Because they are just trying to survive every day. So they stay longer because they think someone's going to come save them. That's one reason. They stay longer because this often happens in what we call high meaning jobs. So jobs that they really like. Maybe they're saving the world. Maybe they're in politics, something that's really valuable to them. So they stay. They stay because they think that if they just do this thing, or if they just talk the boss this way, it's going to get better. They stay because they're afraid of the alternative. I've worked here for a while. I've got a corner office. Why should I leave? And the final reason I think they stay is because, as you said, they have Stockholm syndrome. They just do not have the emotional, the social, the psychological resources to leave that situation. And it's heartbreaking. I get more emails and tweets from people whose spouses or significant others are working in toxic situations, and they're like writing me, help me, help me. And I'm like, I can't help you. Only your spouse or significant other can help themselves, but you have to help them to get out. You have to tell them to get out.
Yeah,
It's sad.
totally. It's sad. It's very sad. But as you say, if you are at that end of the spectrum, the only thing that you can do is to leave the situation. So don't even try to change the other person or try to change the system. And of course, what I'm more interested in, because this is an extreme, is what happens with all these shades of gray, right?
Yeah.
And I think that our listeners are also really looking forward to hearing, what do we do? What are the principles and the guidelines to manage that relationship with a perhaps challenging boss really well? So could you give us a crash course on how to manage a boss effectively?
I will. All right. So it's a really, really simple. I mean, I can't believe I wrote a whole book on it, but it's a really simple process. But it's simple. It's one of those things that's simple, but not easy. Because in order to do it, you have to be willing to actually change yourself a little bit. You got to change how you operate a little bit. So here's what you do. Number one, you take a look at who your boss is, who your boss really is, not who you wish they were, but who they really are. How do they work? What's their work style preference? We can go into that in a little bit, but you want to take a good look at who they are and their preferences, their communication preferences, their work style preferences, their priorities, their pet peeves, all of that. Don't judge it, but notice who they are. Secondly, then you're going to take a look at who you really are. Not who you think you are, not how you wish you were, but how do you really show up at work? What are your preferences? What's your work style? How do you like to communicate? What are your priorities? What are your pet peeves? And then once you have a good sense of who your boss really is and who you really are and how you operate, then you get to assess the gap. You look at the gap. How are you the same? How are you different? And this is when you get to choose. Because your boss isn't going to change. You can't change your boss. So you get to decide how you might want to operate differently. What do you want to do a little more of, a little less of, a little differently? And that is where the power of managing up comes. And again, I don't care if people choose to do nothing differently. I care that they choose. Because when people don't choose, when people just let things happen to them and then complain about them, they just become victims, right? What I want for people is to take really control of your situation situation and be in choice about what you're willing to do more of, less of, or differently to work with the boss that you actually have, not the boss you wish you had. And of course, nothing illegal, immoral, or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. And I'm not surprised actually, but it's so interesting to see how the way that you have been brought up. You talked about this this lesson that you took really early on in your childhood to take control of the situation, and how now it shows up in your work, where you say, the important thing is really make a choice and take control of your situation. And I just want to underscore that because it's so, so important. And I also see a lot of people in the context of organizational culture who will be in that mind frame of a victim and will not make any choices. Yep. And I'm 100% with you that you can either choose to accept it or choose to change it or choose to leave, but you really have to make a choice.
I agree.
I love it. So one of the questions that arised for me as you were talking about really seeing who your boss is and then seeing who you are is, how do you ensure that the way that you look at yourself and the way that you look at your boss is objective? Because I think for a lot of us, we have a lot of blind spots. And I'm curious what you have to say to that, and what would you advise our listeners to be a little bit more objective than we tend to be about how we look at ourselves and at others as well.
That is, if I could like literally wave a magic wand, I would change it for everybody, because this is ingrained in us, right? So let's start with ourselves first. People are delusional about who they really are. So in order to really pay attention to who you are, you need to ask people, what's your impact, right? You need to really take a good look and be willing to understand that you're not perfect or that people may misunderstand you. So what I often do, one way I try to get people into this is I talk about the difference between intent and impact. So we all walk around with our intentions, right? Our intentions are to do whatever they are to do. And we judge ourselves on our intention. Well, that's what I meant to do. This is what my intention is, right? Internally, that's how we judge ourselves. But we're judging other people on their impact on us. So they have a behavior, they do something, we interact with them, and that's how we judge them on their behavior, not their intention, because we don't know their intention. And so what happens is we're judging ourselves and other people on different things. So for example, let's say that you're driving a car somewhere and somebody cuts you off. What's the first thing you say? You say, "Oh, what a jerk you are," right? You call the other person, you judge that behavior, right, on their intention. They were a jerk. But we might also be driving that car and we're going to cut somebody off, and we don't call ourselves a jerk, do we? No, we say, "Oh, sorry, it was the circumstances, like that. My intention wasn't to do that." And so in order to really notice people, you have to start looking at the behavior, and you have to let go of of your assumption about the intention. You don't know what the intention is. So you've got to have a little bit of empathy, and you've got to just be able to separate behavior from intention.
I love that, Mary. I really love that. And I recently interviewed Cy Wakeman, and I'm sure you know her work.
Love her.
And she talks about, she's amazing. And she has this wonderful exercise where she says people should really take a piece of paper and write down the story that they are telling themselves, and then highlight or underline all the words that might not be a fact. So you don't know it 100%.
I love it.
Edit this story out, and you will realize, and I actually did it with one situation that kind of upset me. And I realized that out of a story of a whole page, I was left with a sentence basically. Yeah. And the way it changes how you look at the situation, it's just mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing. What I often do with people in my workshops is I'll say, think about either your boss or a colleague, the most challenging person you work with. Why are they challenging for you? And I do this after I do the whole spiel on intent versus impact and fundamental attribution error. And I say, I want you to use an I statement, and I want you trying not to label that person. People can't do it. They will say, what bothers me about this person is that they are judgmental, they are mean-spirited. And I'm like, you don't know that. What is the behavior that is bothering you? And it's really fascinating. It's not, that's why I say this is simple, but it's not easy.
It's not
Dropping
easy.
our stories and our projections about other people, which, by the way, might be right, but chances are they're not completely right, is the hardest thing people can do. But the thing about dropping the story behind our what we think about other people or even about ourselves is that when we are annoyed by our bosses, when we're talking about difficult behaviors, we tend to get mad or angry, right? And then when we get into those lower negative emotional ranges, then we kind of become victims of our own amygdala, our reptile brain, and then we go into fight or flight. And when we're in fight or flight, our executive functioning doesn't work as well. And so that's going to keep you from being strategic. Like, it's like the exercise you did. Once you realize that you were trapped by your emotions, if you can let that go, you can see alternative strategies to dealing with that person.
Totally,
or that
totally. It's
situation.
incredible. And it's so important. I mean, I personally see a huge change in how I operate also on the days when I meditate or not, because just taking myself into the space where I can be calm, and then
Yep.
it really helps me practice this muscle of being aware of the narrative that I have in my head. And when I forget to do that, it just takes over. It's incredible. So I can completely relate to that, how important that can be in how we show up and how we manage these relationships. So you talk about have a look at who you really are, not who you wish you were,
Yeah.
and who your boss is, and what are the gaps, and then think what you can do to start bridging some of these gaps. So could you give us a couple of examples of how people that you know, maybe some of your clients, did that effectively, and what difference it made in the relationship?
Yeah, so there's so many great examples, and oftentimes, I will take people through like different personality types and things like that. So I have a lot of people. So do you want to talk about introverts and extroverts for a minute? Because that's a big one. People they resolve this all the time. So introverts and extroverts tend to operate very differently in the world, right? Introverts are energized from within. That means they're a little more contained. They do a lot more internal processing. They are not necessarily the warm and fuzzy bosses. They're not checking in a lot. They're probably they're not brainstorming. They don't feel like they don't feel like they care. I mean, they do, but that's how they may feel. And so I have a lot of people complain to me about their introverted bosses. Like, I had this one person come to me and she was like, "Oh, my boss hates me. She doesn't share information. She's this, she's that." And I said, "Well, maybe she's just an introvert. Have you ever thought about that?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, but what does that mean?" I said, "I want you to go do this. I want you to start scheduling meetings with her. You need to be proactive and schedule meetings with her. If you're waiting for her to reach out to you, you're going to be waiting for a very long time." Secondly, I said, you need to stop popping into her office every 5 seconds. Like, tell her ahead of time what you want to talk about. And then you need to just stop chit-chatting. Like, just get to the point and build the relationship slowly. And so she did. And literally in like 30 days, she was emailing me back going, "Oh my God, my boss is really nice. She's really warm." And I'm like, I told you, like, we have to realize that people operate differently. I was doing a workshop for this financial firm, and we were talking about introversions and extroverts. And this woman jumps up, and I just finished talking about how, you got to schedule meetings with introverts, be proactive. You should not like just sit there and like talk at them, give them their space, understand their need to be alone. And this woman jumps up and goes, "Oh my God, I think I've been annoying my boss for the last 7 years." And I said, "Oh my God, is your boss in the room?" And she points to the CEO. And she was his executive assistant. And I said, "Has she been annoying you for 7 years?" And he goes, "Dear God, yes." Like, because she was a raging extrovert, right? And she was like just in his office talking to him all the time, and he doesn't need that. And literally in that like 30 seconds, they resolved the 7-year problem just by understanding the differences in how they were energized.
I love that. I love that. And these are great examples. So thank you for that. And, because of course, the focus of this podcast and what we talk a lot about is culture. And I remember reading in your book that you say, you can't really change the culture of the whole company. So if it's completely toxic and dysfunctional, then you should leave. But I'm really curious about your thoughts on, can a team member have influence on the culture within a team when the boss might be part of the problem? What do you think?
I think to some extent you can. I mean, I have seen in many organizations, I've seen in really toxic cultures or really difficult cultures, I have seen small teams of like-minded people create their own kind of safety culture, like their own kind of subculture where they are kind and nice to each other. So I do think it's possible. I would say to people that have to do that, like, it's a lot of extra work to do that. But if you are an influential person, it's completely possible to create a little mini culture with your like-minded teammates. I was talking to a group the other day, and we were talking about working for the impulsive boss, this boss that was really impulsive, and which I always say to people, it's a better team sport to manage that boss than individual sport. And the woman in the group said, we have a very impulsive boss, so the team and I have like gotten together, and we're this really tight-knit group, and we figured out ways to manage that. And the culture with the three of us, she said, is really positive. So that's the reason why she is staying.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that culture very often is both global and local. So, of
Yes.
course, you are going to feel the vibes coming from the wider culture around you. But I really do believe, and we've seen that through the diagnostic tools that we use, that you do have subcultures. And sometimes they are as small, as you said, as 3 or maybe even five people in a team. And the experience is completely different. And so I personally really encourage people to focus on that area of influence that they can have and really do what they believe is going to work within their teams, rather than worry that the boss or the boss's boss is not the person that you would like to have as a boss. So it's good to hear that from you, being an expert on how to manage these relationships. And the second question that I have, Mary, to you is, would you, or have you ever seen team members having a conversation with a boss where they actually talk about the culture and talk to the boss about the impact that their behaviors have on the team and on the culture that is created in the team? Is this a total no-no, or are there ways to do it constructively and with a positive impact?
All right, so that is a great question. So it's a little bit of both. All right, so here's kind of the rub on this one. If you have a boss who's open to that kind of conversation and feedback, like here's how your actions are impacting us, chances are that boss isn't that horrible, right?
Yeah.
When you have a boss who's not open to that kind of stuff, they tend to be more horrible. So that being said, there are lots of ways and gradations of this conversation. I always recommend that people go have a conversation with their boss about their boss's preferences, their pet peeves, their priorities. And I have a conversation template that I'm happy to share with your listeners on how to do this. It's a pretty safe conversation. It's a pretty easy conversation. And it's a conversation you might have more than once. And yes, of course, bosses should be having this conversation with their employees. What's your work style? How do you like to work? Blah, blah, blah. But if your boss doesn't, there's no reason why you can't go have that conversation. And I end every workshop with this. And, there's always someone that emails me later and says, oh my God, I went to have this conversation with my boss and it completely changed our relationship. So go have the conversation. Number 2, if you need to give your boss feedback. So that's an easy conversation about work style. Let's talk about if you want them to change their style, like talk about their impact a little bit. The next level of less danger, we're moving up a little bit difficult here. The first one's the easy one. Second one's middle hard, is take your feedback and put it into the form of a request. Okay. So instead of saying to your boss, you don't communicate and here's the impact of that, I would go and just make that little, like, inside of every complaint, there's a request, find the request. So a request would look like something that you need, like I need more information on XYZ. Why you need it? I need it because people are coming to me for this information, and when I don't have it, it's slowing down the works. The benefit to them, the organization, and to the stakeholders. So if I had this more information more timely, I could get this done for you faster, this done for your boss more effectively, blah, blah, blah. And then how you're going to make it happen. So I was thinking, boss, like I would come, like put 5 minutes on your calendar every Monday and just get the download from you. Would that work for you? And that's how you kind of do that. So you kind of not soft pedal, but you instead of talking about feedback, you're making requests for different behavior or different things that you need, different tools. Got it? And then the high level is when you actually have to have like a team meeting where you are going to be very direct and do the basic SBI, situation, behavior, impact, and talk about it. Sometimes, depending who your boss is, that might be better to have an outside person in, maybe someone who mediates, maybe a coach, maybe you do it as part of a team building event, maybe you enlist some other executives. I was at this big construction firm the other day and they were talking about this boss who was just really horrible. And one of his peers on the same level literally went to him and said, you are being an asshole and here's what you're doing and here's how it's coming across to your team. And the guy honestly had no idea. So that was a good happy story because he changed. But it's very tricky. There's so many different shades of gray you have to figure out in that. I would say for the last way to sort of like talk about the impact of your boss's behavior or request new things is, and this is going to sound really simple, but this is where those personality assessments like the DISC, the Myers-Briggs, the Berkman, this is where if you have a really good like facilitator to come and do a team meeting, this has been very eye-opening for a lot of people. It's kind of a baby step into understanding how your behavior as a boss may be helpful or not helpful. So that if you have a qualified person, you can really have some really great conversations and begin at least to open the eyes up of your boss, because they may not. I mean, there's a big difference when a boss knows their behavior is toxic and abusive or bad or just not helpful and they don't care, and when they actually have no idea. So you have to kind of navigate that to figure out how to get the behaviors and the cultures improved by people understanding, making the connection.
Yeah, totally. And I recently spoke to Seth Godin, who told me he was talking about how he was shaping culture in his companies. And now he does a lot of workshops and seminars that are online. And it's incredible how they can create a culture that is very supportive and very generous. And so I asked him how he does it. And he gave me this example of a guy who worked for him, who was a yeller. And so he would yell in the meetings, and Seth said he was excellent in terms of his performance, but I hate yellers, and I didn't think that this is the kind of behavior that we want to have in the company. So I took him aside, and the guy was over 50 years old, and I told him, listen, you are yelling. I can't have that. If you yell again in a meeting, I will fire you in front of everyone. And well, so of course that wasn't speaking to a boss, it was the other way around. But nevertheless, to your point, this person said, you know what, I never realized how I might be coming across. Thank you. And he never yelled again. Yeah. So I think that for some people, they never get this feedback. It's very true. So creating a situation where they can get feedback either from a consultant or from a tool or from someone that they trust, I think that sometimes can be a solution, because it may be really a blind spot.
It might really be a blind spot. Absolutely. And I wish if more bosses did what Seth did would be very helpful, but all too often bosses or top leadership, at the end of the day, they value the productivity, the money, the bottom line, and they just don't make the connection that even though that person's bringing in a brilliant performer, they actually don't realize that brilliant performer is reducing the performance of everybody else.
Exactly.
So it's really a problem.
Yeah, it's so true. So one last question that I have is, I'm super curious because I know that you do a lot of workshops and work with a lot of organizations. What is the most frequently asked question that people have for you about managing their boss?
I would say people get very specific about the type of bosses that they have. And so I would say the number one thing I get asked is, how do you deal with the micromanager?
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us, how do you deal with a micromanager? Because I think it is quite a frequent one.
Yes, I can. So the first thing you need to know about a micromanager is that they can be managed and that you are going to hate every second of it, right? But it is actually the easiest one to deal with. All right. So micromanagers have a high need for certainty. Okay. It's one of David, David Rock and his SCARF stuff, his neuroscience. So, we all as human beings have the neuropsychological need for autonomy, right? We want to be captains of our own ship. We want to have our own agency. We want to make our own choices, blah, blah, blah. And when we don't get that, when a manager steps on that, we go into, fight or flight, amygdala, the whole thing, right? We get angry, frustrated, mad. But we also have to realize that people also have a high need for certainty, right? The sun's going to rise, the sun's going to set, I'm getting paid on Friday, and you're going to deliver that project the way it's supposed to be delivered. And so when our micromanagers will have a high need for certainty, and that's going to bump up against our need for autonomy. So what you need to realize is that if you have a micromanager, you are never going to get your autonomy until they get their certainty. The more you resist their need for certainty, the tighter they are going to hold on to the reins. So you've got to take a deep breath and figure out what's going to give them certainty. Now, usually it's a combination of more information, more inclusion, or more control. So you need to find ways to give that to them. So number one, don't take it personally. Unless, however, you are the only person on your team being micromanaged. Then you need to take it very personally, because that means you are not doing something that they need. So you have to go and figure out what it is that they need. You've got to put your autonomy on hold for a minute in order to find out what they need in order to trust you to give them their certainty. So that's going to require finding out what they need, anticipating their needs, finding out what success looks like. You want to make sure you are giving them lots of information. You want to actually over communicate, give them so much information until they feel completely satisfied that you are doing what they want to do. And if they have particular ways of doing something, you're going to have to do it that way. It is just going to take them longer to trust you. And you need to stop resisting that. And I know you're going to be angry, you're going to be bitter, it's going to take extra work, but it is the only way to get your autonomy. And 95% of the time, it will work.
I love that.
I learned this lesson. Yeah, I learned this lesson in one of my first jobs. One of my first leadership jobs. I was the director of public relations for a museum here in DC. And I had this terrible micromanager boss. And it wasn't just me, she micromanaged everybody, even though we were part of the senior team. So I thought, well, I can't live like this. Like, I can't do this, right? And I had to sit right outside her office. I couldn't even have my own office. So one day I said, I'm just going to just give her everything she wants. So I typed up this massive list of everything, a status update of everything I was working on and where it was. And I printed it out and I put it on her chair, because that's how she liked her information, every morning. She would get this list and she would and then I would do it again in the evening. So I would do it twice a day. And then she would redline it and hand it back to me. And she would even actually correct my grammar. But I started noticing that, there were certain things that were more important to her than others. So I started putting all her priorities on the top of my list, right? And so I did this twice a day for about, 6 weeks. And then I reduced to once a day for about 3 or 4 weeks. Then I did it to every other day. And then I got down to about once a week. And at that point, she gave me my own office and she never bothered me again.
Wow.
The whole thing took 4 months. But it was worth every ounce of effort.
Wow.
Yeah, because I was just I know, for her, and I didn't judge her. I mean, I didn't enjoy doing it, but actually at the end of the day, that list of all my status updates became a great resume, because I knew everything I worked on for 2 years. But instead of getting angry and pissed, I said, what can I do? I got strategic. What can I do to try and get this woman's trust from what she needs to hear or see?
Which I think is a really good principle to follow in all relationships, I think, in our lives. In terms of, give people what they need first, and then you can make your requests. But usually, and especially, of course, when the power is not equal, like in the relationship of a boss and a team member, it's a really great advice. Just figure out what is important for them and give it to them first. And then by doing that, you win their trust, and it's so much easier to work with this person. I love that. It makes total sense.
We call it the platinum rule, right? So we have the golden rule, which is treat other people as you want to be treated, give other people, what you would need, But if you turn it to the platinum rule and you treat other people how they want to be treated, and give them what they need, not only are you building that relationship faster, but you're also learning a new skill. Like I learned how to deal with micromanagers. I learned how to do status reports. Like I learned so much more when I get out of doing things the way that I want to do them, or based on what I need, and I put the other person first. It's really an amazingly powerful and empowering thing to do.
And I think that's why you said that in your book that we learn from the bad bosses very often much, much more than we learn from the nice bosses. And this is a perfect example of how she forced you to do stuff that maybe you didn't like doing, but eventually it was a really great learning experience.
It was. And the more that, the thing that I want people to remember when they're acting as a quote unquote follower is that the leaders that people tend to really like are the leaders that are very adaptive to them, right? So people tend to really appreciate leaders that have more than one style, that can look at Aga and say, here's how Aga likes to work. I'm going to try and create a work situation or experience for Aga that's good for her. Here's how Mary likes to work. I'm going to adjust myself a little bit so that Mary can be successful, right? We all love leaders that do that. And so if we want to be leaders that know how to adapt to other people's needs, wants, preferences, priorities, and pet peeves, we learn that by learning how to manage up. Because by managing up and managing across, we actually become better at managing down.
I love it. Okay, so let's move to the rapid fire questions. This is a section of this interview where we ask 5 questions in rapid succession. And the idea is that you will answer them under 2 minutes. Okay. Awesome.
Wait. So my answer is less than 2 minutes, or I can't think for more than 2 minutes.
No, your answers to all the 5 questions will be under 2 minutes.
Okay, got it. I'm ready.
And I think speaking as fast as you do, it's going to be super easy for you. Okay, so let's go for it. So how do you define organizational culture?
I define organizational culture by the way we do things around here. So organizational culture is about our norms, our behaviors. It's really about the accepted and promoted behavior of people in that organization. And I think it stems deeply from what people feel like they need to do or be in order for them to survive and in order for the organization to survive. So I think it's really, I know I love all the fancy definitions, but it's really basically, here's what we do around here, and here's how we do it, and here's how we need you to do it.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
When people are leaving, when people say this culture sucks, when there's low engagement, when there's low positivity. I think those are some examples. I really believe that strong cultures have equal high amounts of productivity and positivity. So I think when positivity or productivity is low, people are leaving, people are disengaged. When you ask someone, what would you tell your best friend about how to succeed here at this organization? And when they go, oh, like that, your culture needs work.
What company do you admire for their culture and why?
All right, so I know this is very common. I'm gonna say Zappos, and it's not so much that I do admire the culture. I admire Tony Shaw, and I admire him because of the way he's talked about culture, the way he's very honest about his first company. He did a really bad job on culture, and he said it was terrible. And the next time was Zappos, he was going to do it differently. So I love that he cares about his culture. I love that he pays people to leave his culture when it doesn't work. And I'm very intrigued, although not necessarily a supporter, I'm very intrigued by the whole thing he's doing around holacracy, which is really sort of like the democratization of culture. I don't think it's going to work, but I'm intrigued that he's really thinking about it and that he thinks about it and then he puts kind of his money where his mouth is. So he just doesn't flap on about culture, but I think he's actually experimenting and doing interesting things with it.
So Zappos and Tony, yeah. Okay, awesome. And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend? And by the way, I would definitely recommend our listeners check out Managing Up. But what do you read and who do you learn from about leadership and culture?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. All right. So there's some oldies but goodies that I like. I love, and it's an old one, but I love The Art of Possibility by Xander and Xander. I just find because it's his own journey as a conductor, which can often be a very toxic thing. I find that an amazing book, one of my favorites. I'm loving some of the Dan Pink stuff, especially his earlier stuff. I think that's really great. I like things that are kind of researchy based. Um, I love Malcolm Gladwell. I like people that pull like different social things into organizations. I can do it. So I kind of like the more lateral stuff, like Freakonomics. I don't know. It's funny because I love all the leadership and organizational stuff, but I really like the stuff that brings in social science because it helps me get more creative about how I'm thinking about leadership and organizations.
And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Go have a team conversation. Go have a team conversation about how people like to work. What are your work style preferences? What's your time orientation? What are your priorities? What are your pet peeves? What's the SOP of me, the standard operating procedure of me? Have the teams really talk about how they like to work as individuals and then talk about how they are currently working as a team. And is that working for everybody? Are there some things they could do more of, less of, a little bit differently? Like what are some things we could shift so that everyone in the team can be successful, everyone in the team can feel valued, everyone can be productive and positive and still adding value to the organization. So have the conversation, create SOPs of me, create SOPs of the team, and just have the conversation and talk to your people and then be willing to adapt to others. Because when we're willing to adapt to somebody else, just might be willing to adapt to us as well. But if everybody's waiting for everyone else to adapt to them, nothing ever changes.
I love this idea of an SOP of me, and
Right?
working with teams. I've done this exercise with some of the teams that I work with, and it works perfectly. And
It
I
does.
love it. So, just to explain that to our listeners, what that is, can you say a few words of how you do an SOP and how do you share it with your team?
So an SOP of me was when people fill out, like a template around how they like to work. So you will include things like communication preferences, work style preferences, priorities. What do you care about at work? How do you like to communicate? How do you like to work? What are your pet peeves? For goodness sake, that's really important to have pet peeves. What's your decision making process look like? How do you like to interact? Everyone fills out the same form, right? Basic categories. And then you go and you get together with your team and you share them. So everybody will go around and talk about how they like to communicate. And, then you discuss it and you find ways that you can do things better. Like I might be like, oh my gosh, Aga, I didn't realize that you prefer email. I'll stop popping into your office and I'll start sending you more emails, So things like that. It's really important to understand how we operate. And then when the team can talk about it without judging each other, then they can use these SOPs to find ways that we can all interact better with each other. Because the idea here is to find out, as we've talked about before, what works for other people and see what you can do more of, less of, or differently to close that gap. And if you are willing to adapt to somebody else, that's going to make them more willing to adapt to you. When we're all sitting around waiting for everyone else to adapt to us, to do things the way that we like to do them, then we're all waiting for a long time. So the idea is to build a culture where we are putting other people's needs at least in the same par as ours and trying to find a way where everyone can get what they need, everyone can feel productive, everyone can feel positive, everyone can feel engaged so that everyone can succeed. You can succeed, they can succeed, the team can succeed, and therefore the organization can succeed. It's really about finding out how everyone can adapt to make it a great workplace for everybody.
Fantastic. Mary, thank you so much for this conversation. It was amazing, and I've learned a lot from you. I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot from you. I don't know if you would like to leave our listeners with some final thoughts.
Yeah, my final thoughts would really be, you spend most of the listeners, I'm guessing, if you're a working adult, you are spending most of your waking hours at work, or at least as many at not work, right? So if you're spending most of your waking hours at work, I want those hours to be the best hours for you. I want your work life to be one where you feel creative, energized, where you get to use your passion, your intellect, you get to bring your whole self to work so that you can have a really great career career. And by managing up, I hope that will help you in a small way, even just be able to really take control of your career. You have one career, it should be yours. You need to own it. I want it to be great for people. And I'm truly hoping that by managing up, it will help you become a career victor and not a career victim.
I love that. And I'm sure that also for people who are able to manage up more effectively, they will also be able to help their leaders and their teams to cultivate better cultures as well. So I can't think of a better way to finish this conversation. Thank you so much. Just one thing that I suppose people might be curious about is how can they get in touch with you, or where can they find more about you and your work?
Well, it's been a delight speaking with you. People can find me you can find me on LinkedIn, Mary Abbajay. You can find me on Twitter, Mary Abbajay. You can find my website, careerstonegroup.com, or literally just Google Mary Abbajay and I'll come up somewhere for you. But please reach out. And if anybody wants to reach out and email me, I will send you a conversation template to show you how you can have a great conversation with your boss about managing up, managing down, and managing across.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you, Aga. It's been delightful.
I'm Abbajay, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And now it's time for the preview of the upcoming episode. And my next guest needs no introduction. It's Simon Sinek. Here's a short snippet from our conversation where Simon talks about the different ways people react to the coronavirus pandemic, and also about what should be the biggest area of focus for leaders right now. Enjoy.
Everybody deals with stress and trauma differently, and there's no right or wrong. Some people are in go mode and some people are in panic mode, and we can't criticize the people who are shutting down. We have to just be there for them and be patient with them. And we have to lean on the people who are in go mode for now. We also have to ask our team to look out for each other. We have to ask our team to check on each other, that especially if someone lives alone, to make sure that we all remember them and check in on them. And at the end of the day, the leader has to remember that the cause that they're hoping to advance is bigger than anything or anyone in the company. And the importance of saving everyone's job is more important than saving one person's job. And we have to try and maintain a broad, long-term view, despite the fact that the stresses are immediate and short-term.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.